Welcome to CP Newsroom. I'm Morgan Lee. In the past month, we've seen headlines coming out of Crimea, Ukraine, and Russia about the political uprisings in East Europe. But concurrently, there have also been uprisings going on in Venezuela. To talk to me today about the intersection of religion and these protests, I'm joined by Alejandro Velasco. He's a historian out of NYU, and he studies Latin America. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So, can you give us a sense of what the intersection between church and state is like in Venezuela?
It's a fraught relationship, particularly under the presidency of Hugo Chavez and now his successor, Nicolás Maduro, who's been in office since April of 2013. Hugo Chavez maintained a very tense relationship, particularly with the church hierarchy. Venezuela is a majority Catholic country. And the church, especially in its higher echelons, has long been associated with the opposition. And as a result of that, the clashes between the government of Hugo Chavez and the church were sometimes very dramatic. Over the last 2 or 3 years, however, you've begun to see a little bit of a toning down of that contentiousness between the church and the state. You still see the church emitting some statements against particular government programs or government actions. You still see support, certainly, for human rights emitted by the church. On the other hand, the kind of acerbic tensions that you had seen before, those are less apparent now.
So something that you're saying that suggests to me is that potentially the Catholic Church was representing more of the middle and upper classes interests, as Chavez was known for having this very intentional message for the poor people in there. Is that the cause of this division?
It is and it isn't. One of the interesting things to consider is that even though you're right, there's a very strong class divide in Venezuela. Church membership certainly cuts across classes, right? So popular sectors, just as much as middle and upper classes, participate and engage in popular Christianity or Catholicism very significantly. And so it's not so much the case that the class divide explains these tensions. I think what mostly explains is that certain sectors, especially of the church hierarchy, tend to and have tended to align with more elite sectors, whereas more expansively, more broadly understood church, that cuts across classes.
Where do you see Protestants fitting in? I know that you mentioned earlier that Venezuela has a predominantly Catholic population, but there are multiple thousand Christians that live in here.
Sure, and that number has increased, and it's part of a continental trend in Latin America, especially beginning in the 1970s and 1980s. You see a rise in evangelicalism, you see a rise in other Christian denominations, Protestantism and whatnot. It's made a big impact in places like Brazil and Chile. Venezuela has been slightly less. You do tend to see some Protestant participation, but mostly where you see non-Catholic Christian participation is in evangelicalism. That has experienced a significant rise in the 1990s and 2000s.
Is there some sort of political impact that growing has incurred?
Not so much. We don't see it. I mean, there's some really interesting work. My colleague, sociologist David Smiley at the University of Georgia, has done really interesting work around the interplay of politics and evangelicalism in Venezuela. And the way that he frames it is that evangelicalism provides, especially for its adherents, a sense of purpose and functionalism in context of high tension and chaos, social tension and chaos, right? So people flock to religions that they imagine provides them with a sense of structure, right? And so that has accounted for some of the rise. But in terms of the actual link between sort of evangelicalism and the political environment, that's very diffuse.
To what extent has liberation theology played a role in Venezuela and the politics there?
Less so than you've seen in other places, right? I mean, certainly right now you think of liberation theology and you immediately go to the Pope and Pope Francis and his experience in Argentina. What you tend to see is that when he was president, Hugo Chavez very much drew on that social justice strand of liberation theology, Catholicism, as a way to sort of infuse his political message with this undertone and sometimes overtone of Christian rhetoric. what's been significant is that hasn't really played out too much at the level of popular sectors, right? And so, yes, you see individual priests in various parishes throughout the country, especially in rural areas, propagating a message around liberation theology and its sort of ideas of social justice. But that doesn't necessarily carry over nationwide, and it certainly doesn't play too much in the hierarchy of the church in Venezuela, right? So liberation theology just has an impact, and it's certainly one that was deployed strategically and politically by Hugo Chavez, but in terms of its actual impact, it's hard to see.
Can you just talk briefly about popular expressions of spirituality in Venezuela?
Yeah, Venezuela has a very strong tradition of popular spirituality. And so, for instance, that plays out ethnically. So Afro-Venezuelans primarily inhabit the coastal regions. They have popular expressions of religiosity, like Corpus Christi. In the central mountains of Venezuela, you have the cult of Maria Leonza, which is sort of a spiritist cult that incorporates blends a variety of Christian and non-Christian traditions. Numerically, they don't have a tremendous amount of following vis-a-vis, for instance, Catholicism, but they do have a very significant impact in terms of popular culture, right? And so, for instance, again, to draw on Hugo Chavez's skillful deployment of multiple religious traditions, right? He would strategically call upon sort of the Corpus Christi factions, and he would call on Maria Leoncistas, right? And as a way to sort of integrate into a syncretic kind of mix the idea that Venezuela is a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-class, but also multi-spiritual society.
Very fascinating. Well, thank you so much for being able to come in, Professor, and share this with us.
You're welcome.
For CP Newsroom, I'm Morgan Lee, and we'll see you next time.